Welcome to the Strategy and Leadership Podcast, the podcast that brings you practical advice, lessons, and stories from senior leaders and thought leaders from around the world. The Strategy and Leadership Podcast is brought to you by SME Strategy, working with organizations around the world to create and implement their strategic plans. To learn more, visit SMEstrategy.net. And now, your host, Anthony Taylor.
Hey there, folks. Welcome to today's episode of the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. My guest today is John Miles, who is the founder and CEO at PassionStruck. John, how's it going?
And Anthony, I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and serve your audience.
That's my pleasure. Thank you for chatting with us. As we kind of chatted before we started, one of the things that really I thought you'd be a great guest today because you have such a very scope of experience, from consulting to being a CEO to working inside like a very large, well-known organization, which I will let you introduce. But it's just cool to hear both your trajectory over the past kind of 20, 30 years, and then what's led you into what you're doing now. So maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit more about you and how you got to where you are.
Sure. Ever since I can remember, leadership has been something that has just fascinated me. And so even as a kid, I looked for leadership opportunities whenever I could, whether that was on a sports team or by taking a new job, whatever. And so as I was in high school and planning for what I saw my life was going to become, I started looking at where I wanted to go to college. And the Naval Academy came up, and I just thought, what better opportunity to go to a place that builds leaders than to go to one of the service academies. And so I ended up going to the Naval Academy, served as an officer for a number of years in the Navy, where I really learned more about how to become a servant leader, and then ended up getting out, not to actually pursue a civilian career, but to become an FBI agent. And as fate would have it, which I think is an important lesson, sometimes life throws us curveballs, and that's what happened to me. I was about 2 days from going to my Quantico class, and Congress was in one of these budget fiascos like we're experiencing right now, and they had to recycle my class. And so it ended up being about 3 years later that I would have had the opportunity to go. And at that point, I ended up getting into management consulting, Big Four consulting, which I ended up doing for the next 6, 7 years of my life, and then pivoted because another life event happened. I was at Arthur Andersen when Enron transfolded and transpired, and so had to move then into industry, and then spent the next 12 years of my life in Fortune 100 companies, eventually becoming a C-level at Dell Computers, and then transitioned into private equity. Did that for a number of years, both as a partner in a private equity firm and as a CEO in several portfolio companies. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, I launched PassionStruck.
That's first of all, so cool. And me as a I'll call it a lay person, got my own chops that I've done, but that's just awesome. That's so cool. You really got to the peak of pretty much everything that you are working within. And then, being the CIO of Dell is no small feat too. And I can't help but ask or help wonder. I won't ask because we don't have several hours, but all of the compounding learning that you had, what you learned from the Navy and how it supported you in consulting, what you learned in consulting and how it supported you in those, data and technology roles, what you learned there and I mean, that's kind of the impetus of the podcast. And then of course, leading all of that into your book and into your work. So we'll chat about that for a little bit. But I'll tell you, what are some of the top 3 biggest kind of takeaways from, your awesome career? I don't know, I have a better word to say it, that kind of guide how you view leadership now and how you view running a successful business that you could share with our leaders.
I'll tell you one thing right off the bat. I'd be a much better consultant today than I was earlier in my career, because I think it's great being a consultant because you get to go see all kinds of different environments. You get to lay out game plans. But the big drawback is you don't get to implement any of them.
Mhm.
And so to me, that's where the rubber meets the road and you really become accountable as a leader. So seeing what worked, what didn't work now would be a great thing to have from a perspective shifting aspect of being able to go back and do it again. And I do it to some components with what I'm doing now, but it has made me a much better one. But as far as leadership, one of the things that I was brought up in was really being a servant leader. And I think that that served me extremely well during various portions of my career. But I think the world that we're in now requires a different type of leadership, a leadership that is able to achieve with the influxes of change that's going to happen, a leadership style that deals with how employees want to work in this remote arena of work-life balance that we find ourselves in. And so I am now advocating for what I call the Gardner leadership style, which is we need to nurture those that we're leading in the same way that a gardener nurtures their garden. And just to sum this up in 4 words, it's eyes on, hands off. And a great way to think about this is think about a military leader who is sending, it could be a 4-star at Central Command who is dispatching a SEAL team in the Gulf right now. They have to be eyes on from the standpoint that they're cultivating a group to execute this task where they know they've been prepared properly. They know that they've been educated on what the mission objectives are. They know they've been educated on having the right physical training as well to get them through it. But they also have to be hands off and understanding that when they send them on this mission, that they don't have the perspective of being there in the operating environment that they find themselves in. And so they need to be hands off to let them make the decisions that they need to make that into a successful mission. And I think it's the same way that we need to be leading the people who follow us today in this world is to give them an over sense of direction and how to perform their jobs, but not be micromanaging in the way that they're actually doing it. But also, this incorporates also being ambitious in how you are leading people, which is one of the biggest learnings I made over my career is that so often ego gets the best of us, and being a ambitious leader um, is really going to get you so much farther.
Exactly. And I believe, ambitious, if I heard it correctly, is humble and ambitious. I imagine the two. Um, Let me ask you. So, of course, I want to ask you about, two of those other lessons that you learned. You've been in industry 30 years. You've gone from consulting or military, or I don't know if it's officially military. Is it called military if it's the Navy?
Yeah,
Okay, good.
definitely military.
Okay, good. Just making sure I'm using the right word. So military, consulting, corporate, Fortune 100, 30-year career, you've seen management change and evolve to like the early days of like management by objective. And then now, like different people have their leadership styles. And what you're saying is, being more like gardening and supporting and responding to the needs. You know, what do you tell leaders that might be stuck in old ways of managing? Maybe they are in that command and control way that they don't value, call it transparency, or they aren't necessarily transparent. It's kind of like my way or the highway, because I do believe that there's a lot of organizations that are still like that. How do you move somebody from that, authoritarian leader to somebody that can kind of adapt their leadership style to support more of a gardening philosophy?
I think the way I like to try to do it is I like to institute a 360-degree review if we can, so that that leader can see how they're being viewed by peer subordinates, their superiors, etc. Because oftentimes I think when someone is in this situation, they don't understand oftentimes I find people who are leading this way don't have the best self examination, should I say, practices and how they themselves are seeing themselves act.
Mm,
And to me, when you're acting in this way, you're running into doing things such as showing gratification, even if you do, but kind of in an inauthentic way. You're pushing people so much to be how you want them to be that you're not leveraging the inherent talents that the employees who are working for you have. And so I try to get them to step back and to start seeing things through a different perspective, that the way that they're leading doesn't have to be either or, it can be both and
mm.
taking a more both and approach is going to get them much further in having the employees do perform at the levels that they aspire them to achieve.
I mean, I want to say it's simple, but super smart because, it's like, hey, you don't need to give up what's comfortable for you, but take the opportunity to kind of learn and reflect from what your people want. And if you truly are a servant leader, you're going to be interested in what people want because, that they're the reason you're there. If they don't want it, then they're not gonna do the work. So I like the idea of being able to not just kind of have one singular style, but really looking at the different opportunities and benefits of each. So going back to my original question, what are one or two more kind of lessons that you learn through your experience that take you into today, and as practical, the better.
I'll give you a couple great ones. One is that being right sometimes means being alone. And for me, I found this lesson out in one of the most profound ways. When I was at Dell, I was asked to lead this initiative, which at the time was the largest initiative we were running. We were spending between 100 and 150 million dollars a year on it. And as I was examining the capabilities that we were putting into the business and where the board and Michael wanted to drive the company, that after we spent 7 years completing this, we were going to have a huge gap because the technology we were using didn't facilitate where the business was going to be. And so I remember Michael didn't sit on the executive steering committee for technology. It was made up of the CFO and several of the divisional presidents. And I had found an alternate solution that we could implement at a fraction of the cost. We could do it much more quickly, but it would cause several of these executives to get pie on their face because one of these presidents held my job previously who actually recommended this. And I remember having a coffee with Michael a couple hours before this meeting, and he said sometimes being right means being alone. And oftentimes, even though it's not the popular decision, it's not what they want to hear, you've got to give what you feel is the best decision, what aligns with your core values, what you have come to realize is the best thing for the company in this particular situation. Now, the ramifications may not be what you want them to be. In this case, they were very upset at me for recommending this, but 18 months later, it all came back when the CFO wrote me and said, you were absolutely correct in your recommendation, and the other solution was never going to work. So that's one. Another one is that people speak with their feet. And this is something that I learned from a prior CIO boss of mine, Jay Skibinski. And I remember we were working on this major initiative to overhaul the technology of this company called Lendlease. And we were in this meeting, and you had a whole bunch of the senior leaders shaking their heads saying, we're all in on this. And I remember him talking to me a couple hours afterwards, and he goes, just watch because people speak with their feet. And just as he predicted, people would nod in that meeting and then come out and start acting completely differently. And I think that is one of the biggest issues you have in inauthentic leadership is when you don't lead with your feet, when you don't lead with your actions, it people see that so much more clearly than they do whatever words you want to give them. And so those are just two of the key learnings out of hundreds that I've had over my career.
That's awesome. I'm just like picturing you in that room, about to give your brief. So like let's talk like digital transformation a little bit, if you don't mind, because that's your experience. Now in 2024, there's AI, technology is moving, super fast. There are CIOs or VPs of technology that are in a position where they have to recommend a course of action to not only the CEO, and often it's, small businesses, not necessarily a board, and it's required change. And I think the juxtaposition, or at least the even side by side of, you might be alone in some things, but you absolutely also need to get everybody's buy-in into an initiative. Otherwise, the whole thing will fail. What would you recommend to somebody, whether it's technology or not, that might be recommending an unpopular opportunity, let's say, but also has to make sure that they get the team's buy-in into it? What have you done? What have you seen? What would you recommend?
I mean, I'll give you a great example. And so that principle of sometimes being right means being alone. One of the people who I have seen implement that the most uh, was at the helm of Apple for decades. And yet Steve Jobs knew not only the times that he needed to be right, but how to garner support behind the ideas when he was right. And so I think it's once you understand with conviction that something is going on the right path, it's having all of you passionately supporting it and really going out to the others in the organization and being a prophet as to why this is the correct approach. So a great example of this would be Mark Benioff. When he started Salesforce, cloud computing wasn't even a thing. In fact, people thought he was asinine for doing it. And I remember when he started this journey and every one of us was running on-premise technology, he would go into rooms where CIOs, CEOs would just laugh at him about creating this universe where people would be operating everything off of the cloud, and they couldn't even see it as a possibility. So I think if you're doing this, what you need to do is oftentimes I have found that people can't see the long-term vision that you have. And so you need to break this down into steps that are shorter term, that people can get behind, that start taking them in the direction that's more towards the vision you want to achieve. And then incrementally, you can then expand what that zone of that aspiration is slowly over time to get more people bought in. And the other thing it does is as you've made progress, you can then use that momentum to carry you forward as it grows. And you can also use this as a way to measure the progress from where you've been to where you are in the future. And I think Steve Jobs did an excellent job of that when he was at Apple.
Awesome. So, as you're driving big change, the baby steps approach, what have you, and trying to garner that success. And I have to say something, and John, this is speaking to your credit, and I'll, to the listener, I'm almost 40. We read books about like Steve Jobs, and you read podcasts, you see all these of like, famous people. But the line of difference between me and Steve Jobs is way different than John and Steve Jobs, or John in these organizations. Because 10, 20 years ago, for lack of a better timeline, they're your competitors. They're the people in the ecosystem. They're the other Fortune 100s. And so like in my belief, or at least what I hear, is like your lens on them is much closer. I was trying to find famous Philadelphia Eagles in my brain, but it's like, hey, you're another professional team competing against all of those people. Like in the time where you were at Dell, that was, I don't want to say peak computing or peak technology, but like that's where those innovations were, like the small innovations were creating significant advantages. And I could only imagine what it was like, having those conversations, like developing those like new revolutionary technologies at once, and then trying to get people on board with like, whether it's cloud computing or personal computing or, VoIP or, data integrity or whatever. I just imagine that it was a fun time. And then, through your private equity life, also like transforming those organizations into like a new digital realm. Am I on base with what I'm saying, or
You're definitely on base.
Yeah.
Well, the time that I was at Dell in the late 2000s was exactly when Steve Jobs launched the iPhone, and we were working on a competitive solution to that. It was being led by Ron Garrig's, who was very famous from coming out of Motorola and created the really the Razor phone, which was at that point the most recognized phone in the world. And I remember we were working on two solutions at the time. One was going to be an Android-based one, and the other was a Windows. And the Android was where we had put all the effort for this new device called a Streak, which is now about the size of your typical phone. But at the time, the critics were saying it's too big. But the interesting thing about watching this was we were all aligned to go Android, and then we all had a meeting with Steve Ballmer, who was the head of Microsoft at the time. Came out of that meeting telling him that we were going to move forward with Android because Windows didn't have as big a presence. And I remember about 3 hours later, Ron calls us into his office and said, Michael struck a deal with Ballmer, and we're dead on arrival because we're coming out on the Windows platform first. And he was absolutely correct. So yeah, seeing all of that, and I had the chance to meet Steve Jobs a couple of times, and I went on probably 40 city visits with Mark Benioff. So yes, I know all these people I'm talking about.
I just think it's so cool. And of course, there's thousands of hours of stuff I'm sure you could share. But just even in that, just being in your position, leading technology, I think and leading just a team. I think one of my big takeaways from today is, that gardener mentality, helping people, fostering people. I really like the idea, like the kind of military concept is you need to prepare these people, but don't touch them, because when it's like really happening, you can't micromanage them. And then leading technological innovation or anything that you're trying to do, whether it's technology or otherwise, heck, it could be HR or finance or whatever. It's, creating those baby steps will provide you more latitude in the future and incrementally get wins so that you can get people to buy in, to support you, and then it'll build a better platform in the future. So John, I'm sure we could talk for a very, very long time. Just as we finish up, how can people get a hold of you, and how can they learn more about the work you're doing with PassionStruck?
So, Anthony, several of the principles that we talked about here, such as the one that I talked about, speaking with feet, the other one that I talked about, being a someone who sometimes is right, sometimes being alone, which I call the boundary magnifier, are all components of my brand new book that's coming out, Passion Struck: 12 Powerful Principles to Unlock Your Purpose and Ignite Your Most Intentional Life. So these are 12 principles that I created observing 700 of the most dynamic leaders over the past 20, 30 years. And I found this recurring pattern of principles that they all used to propel their lives forward. People like Mark Benioff, Steve Jobs, Oprah Winfrey, Jeff Bezos, astronauts, whoever they may be. So that book is now available for pre-order and will come out on February 6th. And in addition to that, I host the Passion Struck podcast, which today was ranked 45th in the world. So if you're looking for something that it's in the health category, but all our episodes are how do you create this fulfilling life through the way that you're approaching your health, your wellness, your overall behaviors, and the choices that you're making on a daily basis. And then you can go to passionstruck.com, which is our website, where you can find me on all the social platforms at John R. Miles.
Excellent. John, thanks for sharing with us today. Remember, John R. Miles. I think it's just so cool what you're doing. I love that you're pouring back into people, evolving what you're doing now. And yeah, check out the podcast. And by the time the episode is out, your book will be out. And so I look forward to that. I think that there's, one of our tenets of the podcast itself is none of us is as smart as all of us. And so to hear, how you've taken that all in and to share with people is pretty awesome. So John, thanks for the time today. It's been such a pleasure, and just wishing you nothing but the best moving forward.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you for having me.
Awesome, folks. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. My guest today, John R. Miles for SEO. Check him out online. Check out the podcast. Check out the book. I think one of the things I'm taking away from today is, there's always a different way to be a leader. There's great ways to evolve as a leader, and versus an or style of leadership, there's always an and style of leadership. And so how can you incorporate other components into your leadership to support you in really helping the people around you? So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. My name is Anthony Taylor. I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider giving us a review. We appreciate you listening and following along, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. And as Anthony says, until next time.